You're looking slick. I like the black outfit, and I like the Superman pin, and then
my Lex Luthor look with my Superman pin. And
that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense.
That wasn't the intentional part, but yeah, I'm enjoying it. So having a good old time.
This is 5 Favorites with Kevin J. Anderson. I am Brandon. You guys all know me. Kevin J. Anderson is one of the best-selling authors in the world.
Sure, you just put that bar as low as you want to be, and
you definitely are, and has written a lot of solo projects, a lot of collaborations, and a lot of media tie-in properties. Probably best known working with Brian Herbert on the Dune novels and various things like that. Sporting your Lex Luthor look, as you said. We're going to be talking inspirations today. 5 favorite inspirations from both of us. I love this one. By the way, these are not in any particular order, and they do not have to be our top. There can be other ones in here. These are just 5 things that inspire us. You have a really interesting one in that you go hiking when you write. You're the only person I know who does this.
And look how fit and muscular I am and everything. Well, you know, I just finished yesterday. I recorded an entire lecture for the Beijing China National Science Fiction Convention, where they wanted me to talk about creating alien worlds. And as a writer, how do you imagine places like the desert planet Dune or the ice planet Hoth and all this stuff? And sure, you can just sit there and use your imagination. Or you can actually like get the ingredients as you experience things. And rather than just like sitting and looking at National Geographics, I like to go to the sand dunes. I like to go to Death Valley. I've been in the Sahara Desert in Morocco.
Did you write in the Sahara Desert?
I went there and took a whole bunch of notes. I wasn't actually starting the dune stuff, but I've written a bunch of the dune stuff, and a bunch of the Tatooine scenes at Jabba the Hutt's palace for my Star Wars books were written in Death Valley, going through like the baking canyons where some of those scenes were filmed.
Now people are thinking you're driving along. No, you are walking.
No, I'm walking
through Death Valley with a microphone
and with water.
Recording.
Yeah, with water. Mm-hmm. And I just think that when you're out, I mean, I've climbed over 100 mountains over 14,000 feet. I've hiked thousands of miles, the Colorado Trail, and just when you're out in nature and hearing the wind through the pine needles and smelling the columbine flowers and looking at the water running through the stream and all that stuff gives you the sensory details that if you haven't experienced it, how do you know what sand smells like? If you're in the baking sand dunes where the heat's just rippling up off of the ground, yeah, you can make it up. But you know, one of the things, I wrote a couple of X-Files books, and one of them took place down in the Yucatan in the Mayan temple ruins, which I had put, there's a spacecraft under one of the temple ruins.
As one does.
Of course, and in order to do that right, my wife and I went down to the Yucatan, and I'm on like this bus to Chichen Itza, handwriting all these corrections to my my manuscript. And going through these jungles in the Yucatan, it's not like a Tarzan movie. It is not at all like what you might think a jungle looks like just from watching TV. And I described it because I was there. And a few years later, I'm doing a book signing, and this big Special Forces Marine guy comes up, and he's kind of intimidating. He just looks me in the eye and he says, "I read your book, and you were really in those jungles, weren't you?" And I went, "Yeah, I went down there." He said, "Yeah, because I was in Vietnam, and nobody ever describes jungles right." And that kind of made me feel good.
That's awesome.
And he didn't beat me up, so that was good too. But
one of the advantages of being a writer, I remember the first time I got to expense going on a trip that I really wanted to write it off. And I actually went to Hawaii because I was writing a book that was set in a tropical climate, which I'd really never been to before. I'm like, wow.
You mean Utah's not a tropical climate? Really?
Yeah. Nebraska, not either. And I'm like, wow, this is actually a tax write-off flying to Hawaii. It's a nice little perk.
Well, and you know, it really is, because as writers, everything we're doing is writing. I like to say that you can't just, if you want to be a chef, you can't just buy cookbooks. You have to have ingredients.
Yeah.
And if all you're doing is like researching stuff but never experiencing anything, you have a bunch of recipes and no ingredients. And I like to just see and experience things. In fact, I used to do almost like the bucket list kind of. I took a hot air balloon ride because I was doing some steampunk stuff. And yes, that's a write-off because I wrote all about being in a steampunk balloon. And we took a cruise around the Mediterranean to all these, the Athens ruins, the sites of the Crusades. We went to Istanbul and Ephesus and all these things. And I wrote a fantasy trilogy about the Crusades. And just the stuff being there is so different from just like writing a book report about it.
You know, it's interesting you mentioned this because I put on my list motion. Motion, for some reason, inspires me. And if I'm ever stuck, I don't go hiking like you do. You're the only person I know that writes while they're hiking. But if I go on a drive just up through the canyon, something about being in motion just jostles my brain, makes it easier to think. I have no idea why that is, but...
Well, and I've actually read studies about it because I do all my stuff by dictating. I've got my recorder and I'm off hiking. Now, there are a couple of reasons, like A, I'm nowhere around when the phone rings and the doorbell rings and whatever else. So I'm like off on a trail and I can just sink into my fugue state and write. But there are these studies about the physical motion kind of kicks the creative juices loose. And I just find that even if I'm stuck on a character, I'll just go for a walk around the bike trail or something like that and just kind of mull things over, and that triggers loose a bunch of ideas. And usually triggers loose a lot of ideas. And in fact, that's why I started dictating in the first place, because I would go out and walk, because how do I fix this space battle, or how am I plotting this? And I'd get like a mile away from home and I'd have this brainstorm of all these great ideas, and then I'd run back home and try to type them all up. And I decided to just take a recorder with me so I could just blather and dictate. Not for anybody but me, but I could put these notes down without, stopping and handwriting something. And that just evolved into more and more outlines and details and all kinds of stuff.
Another one on your list, it's kind of a companion to this, I view at least, is music. We
Yes.
both put them on our list. Mine is music in general. I have trouble writing these days if it's completely silent. I like having it. You put Rush specifically. I can guess, I could have guessed what your favorite band was, knowing you, but tell us, why Rush as specifically an inspiration?
Well, back when I was in high school, I joined, this is going to date me way, way back when, but I lived in a small town, and there was no place around where you could buy CD, well, they weren't CDs, they were albums. And I joined the thing called the
Were you buying
like albums, like the LP albums that
okay.
you played on the record player with the needle and stuff?
I never owned a record in my life.
Well, just because you're a kid and I'm older than you are. Well, but there's this thing called the Columbia Record Club that you got it in the mail. They're all like these little postage stamps of album covers. And I was this nerdy kid. I was probably 15 or something like that. And I thought I wanted to get some albums. And I'm looking at these, and there's a bunch. This was in the late 70s. And there were a bunch of albums by this, there's a group called Kansas, a group called Styx, one called the Alan Parsons Project. Alan Parsons Project had an album called I, Robot, and another one about Edgar Allan Poe stories. And there was this group called Rush, which had A Farewell to Kings and Cygnus X1 and all these science fiction looking things. And it was like 15 albums for $1 if you signed up for this club. So I just like put all these science fiction looking things down. And I liked all of them that came in, but the group Rush, they were these big rock operas about dystopian societies, or a guy gets a spaceship and he wants to explore a black hole, and he gets sucked down into the black hole, and it takes him into another universe where the Greek gods have gone to hide from humanity.
Right.
And like I was this skinny, nerdy kid in high school. And so all the other music that I was listening to on the radio was, Ooh, Baby, Baby, My Girlfriend Left Me. And I'm like, I'm a nerd. I'm not going to get a girlfriend anyway, so I might as well watch or listen to science fiction music.
They say Rush was alternative before alternative existed. It's kind of one of the best encapsulations of who Rush is musically.
I like it.
I remember, one of my roommate in college favorite bands was Rush. And I had listened to Rush on the radio. I didn't really get into Rush until he played the actual albums, not the greatest hits.
The whole albums. You can't just do the
exactly.
one
And
cut.
that's where I put together the things you're talking about. Like, wait, this is a story. Wait, this is, I had just, Tom Sawyer, stuff like that. I'd listened to the top 40s version of Rush. And when I really got Rush, I'm like, oh, I can see why this is his favorite band. This is the same roommate, by the way, who you mentioned that Columbia music thing. They were still doing it when I was in college, but they were CDs. And I'm sure this broke all kinds of laws, but he would join, get his 15 CDs for $1, resell them, cancel, and then join a different one.
You're recording this. You're not supposed to say that on
I won't say who he was, but he was quite the entrepreneur. He made quite a bit of money doing that.
So I was like inspired by all these Rush. They were like fantasy epics and quests across the mountains and things like that. And then when I started writing my first novel, which was published as Resurrection Inc., Rush came out with this brand new album called Grace Under Pressure. And it's this dystopian far future where there's no swimming in the heavy water, no singing in the acid rain. And I'm listening to all these science fiction songs as I'm writing my first novel. And I went, this is the soundtrack to my novel. And I made sure that every song on that album had like a chapter in the book and kind of put it all together.
Cool.
And then when the book was published, I put in the dedication page that this was inspired by this Rush album, and I named the three people, Geddy Lee, who's the singer and bassist, and Alex Lifeson, the guitarist, and Neil Peart, who's the drummer, but he also wrote all the lyrics. So he's writing all these, I mean, he's one of the best drummers ever, but the lyrics were what got me. And I mailed off signed copies to Mercury Records, and it just like disappeared for a while. And then one day I came home from work and there was this letter with a Canadian stamp on it, because Rush is a Canadian band. And it was from Neil Peart, and he had written me this fan letter for my book that was inspired by their album. And he invited me to keep corresponding with him. And we were great friends for 31 years. He just died a year and a half ago. But Neil and I, we wrote a short story together. He wrote the introduction to one of my story collections. But then when Rush was doing what turned out to be their very last studio album called Clockwork Angels, it's a big steampunk fantasy adventure concept album, Neil asked me to write the novel with him. So he and I wrote the novel of Clockwork Angels, and that became a New York Times bestseller. It won some awards, and then we wrote a sequel called Clockwork Lives, which won the Colorado Book Award, and these are just like my favorite books of all of them. And Neil passed away of brain cancer in January 2020, but we knew he was terminally ill for a couple of years, and in his last years, he and I plotted the third one of those books called Clockwork Destiny, and I finally wrote that in Utah last year. I went to Moab and I spent a week just hiking around the Canyonlands, and it just poured out of me. It's one of my favorite books, my most touching books, because I'm remembering brainstorming all this with him, and that'll be published next April. So I'm so pleased and proud of it, because Neil was such an inspiration to me, and now I can kind of turn that around full circle.
You get to work on some of the coolest things. I remember when you were doing your Superman novel, and you're like, I get to write a Superman novel, and things like that. You mentioned on your list someone else who inspires you. My list doesn't have any actual people, but you have Rebecca as one of your inspirations. Do people often inspire you? You're mentioning Neil as a person kind of helping, inspiring you. Rebecca, by the way, Kevin's wife of 30 years.
As in fact, just 2 days ago was our 30-year wedding anniversary. So, you know, I'm not sure that I would just say like the person inspires me, but they act as like mentors, Gandalf, Obi-Wan, that kind of people that I really look up to them. I want to impress them, and I bounce ideas off of them. Rebecca was really important for me because I was kind of a midlist science fiction author, and doing fine, and my books were critically acclaimed, which means nobody bought them, but they got good reviews. And she met me. I think I'd published 3 books then, and they were kind of midlist paperback books. And she sort of took me on as like this Pygmalion project. She said, no, we're going to make you into a professional. We're going to make you dress professionally and treat your writing like a career rather than, I mean, I was a writer, so that meant you just do whatever the heck you want to do, and you don't pay attention to the market. And she just said, no, you got to treat this as a business and focus on it. And I was always pretty business oriented, but she really kind of turned my head straight, and we just worked together on kind of building my professional image, and that really worked. And so she has inspired me, and she continues to be like one of my most ruthless test readers. She goes through, like, none of my big publishing house editors ever goes over a manuscript with as much red ink as what she does.
You know, I can imagine that, because Rebecca is super nice. She is a dear, but she is also, she's whatever the opposite of a pushover is, right?
Right.
Like,
She doesn't take any, like, no.
No, yeah. My third one on my list is actually different from the way that you, some of the things you had. I'm inspired by people doing stories wrong. You ever been watching a movie?
Anti-inspiration.
Yes. And you're watching it, or you're reading a book, and you're like, this twist, they just completely bungled it. How could they bungle this so badly? To the point that you're like, I just have to write a story that does that same twist, but right, or something like that. That happens to me a ton.
Oh, I watch so many movies, and I just sort of slap my forehead and go, no, you didn't set that up, but no, this is where you were supposed to go with that. And so, yeah, I've had many times. But I also have a thing where, like, people who are non-writers will come up to me that they've got the greatest idea in the world that they want to tell me, which they want me to write it, and then we'll split the money, of course.
Yes, that happens a lot.
And I had one many years ago where somebody came up to me who thought that she had the most brilliant idea about, let's think about a future where they just, because there are so many car accidents, that they just outlaw gasoline. And I went, that makes no sense at all. And I started to explain why this wouldn't work. And the only way that this would work is if you did this, and if you did, and I started building it up, and I went, oh, well, what if you have like this genetic organism, like a bacteria or something that mutates and starts eating gasoline and starts eating plastic, and then so it's like almost like a sexually transmitted disease, where it's the gasoline nozzles keeps transferring it through cars, and this plague spreads, and I went, now that would be a good story. And then I wrote it with Doug Beeson, and we optioned it 3 times for movies. It's called Ill Wind, a big end of civilization disaster story where all gasoline and petroleum plastics just goes away. So it kind of sets us back to mid-1800s kind of technology.
One of my, I guess, claims to shame, I've never published this one, and I won't actually even write it, but after the Star Wars prequel stories just kind of did not give me what I wanted, let's just leave it at that.
Okay.
I actually plotted a fanfic that fixed it. It's one of my only fanfic experiences. I'm like, I just have to get this out of my system. Like, how would I have done episode 1 if I had written it myself, if I were in charge? And it was so cathartic to be like, this is what I would do. And then after that, I was able to let it go. Not interested in writing that, but someone doing something that I really wanted to be great but wasn't, that sort of thing kind of sets me off. It gives me a lot of inspiration. And you can find a lot of moments through my books where I've seen something and been like, oh, if they'd done just this instead, it would be really, really cool. And then I file that away in my brain, and then years later, it comes out in a book.
Well, you mentioned my Superman book before. I did one called The Last Days of Krypton, which is like The Last Days of Pompeii, only it's Jor-El and Krypton. And the whole thing started out, but this doesn't make any sense, so I have to make it make sense. So, like, for instance, Krypton is the most advanced planet in 20 galaxies, I think, is what DC Comics did. So if that's the case, how come there's only one spaceship on the planet? And who builds a spaceship that's only big enough to put a baby? If you're going to build a spaceship, make it big enough for mom, dad, and the kid.
Yeah.
So they went, okay, so how do we explain this? And then, so Brainiac shrinks down and steals the city of Kandor, which is another big Superman thing. He keeps this
It's in his lair, not his lair, his Fortress of Solitude.
And then General Zod takes over Krypton. And I started going like, well, wait a second. So if you have like, what if you have Krypton is like 1800s Japan, where they have closed off from the entire rest of the Western world? So what if Krypton is forbidden space travel and everything's closed off? But so Jor-El, who's the genius scientist, he wants to travel, so he invents a dimensional doorway which turns into the Phantom Zone. Right. So that goes off there. And then General Zod's this big powerful guy, but what if this alien, Brainiac, shows up and steals Kandor, basically steals Washington, D.C. Well, think of the turbulence that would introduce into the entire world. And then, so that that's how General Zod takes over. And then so space travel is forbidden, but then there's another thing where the world's going to end because there's a black hole in the core of it. And then a member of the Green Lantern Corps comes, but he's a diminutive guy, and so his ship is small, and it's only big enough to hold the baby. And,
Right, okay.
And so you start,
Yeah.
you take from the beginning, this doesn't make sense, but how am I going to make it make sense? And then when you're all done with it, you go, see, it all makes sense.
Best piece of Superman.
Superman,
Best
okay.
piece of Superman media that you didn't write. What's your opinion?
I'm really still a big fan of Superman 2, the Christopher Reeve
Okay.
one, the
The
original
second-
General Zod.
Okay.
I mean, I watched it several times while writing my book, and it's one of those where it probably doesn't hold up as well anymore, but it still really affected me when I was, I think I was in high school or something when it came out. I think it was John Byrne did a really good a series called Man of Steel, which is kind of a different origin series, and I've read so much of this stuff, and I'm watching all of the shows. We're recording this. I'm not a big fan of Zack Snyder. I think Man of Steel is not the right interpretation of Superman, and we're still kind of waiting it.
I'm kind of glad it exists because I think it's really interesting, but I agree with you. I don't like Superman as objectivist. It just does not work for me. I'd say my favorite piece is tied between Superman 1 and Kingdom Come, which would kind of duke it out for me. Kingdom Come is like alternate timelines, so you can't really elevate it as much, I think, right?
Well, there's so many alternate timelines.
Yes, there are.
But I actually, of the different film versions, I'm really enjoying the portrayal of Superman in the new Superman and Lois TV show. I like the actor. I like his character.
I haven't caught that yet, but I've heard really good things about it.
It's kind of a good, heartwarming thing. But anyway, you grow up with stuff. And I also, in a twisted sense, love the Superman in Frank Miller's The Dark Knight, because he's the Reagan-esque patsy who's truth, justice, in the American way, and screw anybody else around the world who does.
And I mean, if you want to see Superman get nuked, then...
Well...
So, I just had to look up your third one because it's the one I'd forgotten. Obviously, it's craft beers. you put a little quip in there.
Yes.
Sure that Brandon would... yes, because I don't drink. That's just me, leaves more for folks like you. Sure. I am sure that if I did drink, that craft beers, I would totally be a craft beer snob, right? Like that's just totally part of my personality. How does craft beer inspire you?
Well, see, when I was in high school, all they had, when you're college and you're drinking like cheap beer in the dorm room and stuff like that.
Well, not me.
Not you. Okay, yeah. We're talking about my experience here, and. In a parallel sense, which also won't mean anything to you, Starbucks in a similar way suddenly made good coffee widely available.
Okay.
Before Starbucks, it was all crummy coffee, and it was like bitter Folgers and Maxwell House and stuff like that. But then Starbucks came around and suddenly, wait, this is like artisanal coffee. It's strong and rich and stuff. Craft beers is a similar thing. It started. Instead of these big like Budweisers and Miller, all the big kind of generic beers, there were these smaller little breweries where they were like some guy who just loved brewing beer, made it in his garage, and he started selling 6-packs that he bottled by himself. And the craft and care, it's very much like a artisanal bakery or a gourmet restaurant where the person who's making this really cares about the different kinds of beer, whether it's amber or an India Pale Ale or different things like that. And it was just a whole opening the experience to people who had spent too much time drinking cheap beer or cheap coffee. Or I think, let me make it more general. I think in the country over the past 15, 20 years, there's been a resurgence in smaller cheesemakers and smaller dairies and smaller bakeries and they really do great stuff. So it's not this generic all across the country. And I find that just the taste sensations of somebody really, really put all their heart and soul into making this kind of cheddar cheese
Right.
or pecan pie or this kind of coffee or this kind of beer.
That's actually really cool, because in my books, I've often started to think, what kind of weird things? Like, I mean, I want my characters to be into weirder stuff, because in real life, people are into weird things, right? And it feels actually more realistic to be like, no, I'm into something really bizarre. Like there are people who are competitive stone stackers, right? Make stacks of rocks, right? Like, you put that in a book, and people are like, oh, that's what people are like.
Right.
This is what we do, is we
We
find
collect
passions.
bottle caps
Yeah.
or something like that. And
So we're running a little low on time. I'm going to breeze over my fourth one, which was the ocean. You guys, I've talked about
I'm
it.
not there enough, so
Yeah.
it's...
I will travel to where the ocean is if I need to be inspired. We're going to go to our last ones, which are actually kind of paired a little bit. My last one is an inverse of my earlier one, which is when people do something right in writing, it inspires me to do better. And you wrote your last one as writing. Writing inspires you to write more. Writing is one of the things that you love to do most in the world. And I think we are very similar in this. We're a lot of writers, they love writing, but they avoid it at the same time. We're on the other end of the line. You have to force us to not be writing. You have to pry the keyboard or the recorder out of our hands. And if you leave us alone, like our friends will find us around the corner, sitting there madly working on something. Why is it that talk about writing inspiring you?
Well, I really love to write. I mean, I made up my mind when I was 5 years old that I wanted to be a writer. I have never wanted to be anything else. I've done other things because I had to pay the bills. But since I was 5, it's like, I'm going to be a writer. And everything in my life has been down this like a straight and narrow path, that I'm going to do this because it's going to help me be a writer, and I'm going to do this because it's going to help me be a writer, and I'm going to go to college to take these courses because it's going to help me be a writer. And I actually write books faster than I read them, because all I want to do is write. And if I'm reading somebody else's book, that's time that I'm not writing my own books. And I enjoy being with my characters and creating my worlds and going, well, what if we do this? And what if we do this? Whereas if I'm reading somebody else's book, they've already kind of sketched in all the details. So I like doing it myself. And because one of my big loves is hiking, and I do my writing while I'm hiking, I don't have to pick either or. I can do both at the same time. And I mean, there are people who say that I work too hard, I'm a workaholic. I'm going, my mother-in-law once, she just said, Kevin, you worked hard. Why don't you spend the Sunday afternoon and we'll watch football and we'll play card games and you can relax? And I'm going, that's the least relaxing thing in the world that I can imagine. I would much rather be out doing a scene with a sandworm on Dune or something like that. And it's just much, I don't know, it's my imaginary friends that I could torture and do terrible things to.
There's a joke around my house that Brandon hates holidays. Because people expect him to interrupt his writing schedule to go have a barbecue or something like that. And it really is kind of true.
And they can see it on our face that we're not really there. We're all thinking about, like, well, but what if I put this ship in this battle and I can do this something else? And you get good at kind of pretending to pay attention to people. Oh, I didn't really say that, did I?
It actually was, I've talked about it on my channel before. It was a part of my early career that I had to learn to turn that off, because I needed to be there with my family when my family needed family time. But I absolutely understand what you're talking about.
Well, we actually negotiated, because over the Christmas season, all of Rebecca's relatives visit, and it's kind of family time for day after day after day. And we do dinners, and we go to movies, and we go on hikes and everything. And I was kind of miserable, and Rebecca could tell I was miserable. We actually negotiated that if I get up a little earlier in the morning, if I get a couple of hours to write in the morning before anybody else is really around doing anything, then I can be sociable for the rest of the day, because I know I've got my chapter done or whatever. And it's not like I feel I have to get it done. I just feel better when I've got it done.
I actually do the same thing. If I go on vacation, if I can have some writing time in the morning, I feel much better. But we are actually out of time. You've got to run to another thing.
All right.
Give us some promotion. What if people are like, oh, I want to read some Kevin J. Anderson? Where are you gonna point them? Do you have something
Well,
new?
like I said, my favorite ones are the ones I did with Neil Peart. So Clockwork Angels is the first one, that big steampunk fantasy adventure. I've written a lot of Dune novels with Brian Herbert. In fact, we're recording this at FanX in Salt Lake. And the next book just came out, The Lady of Caladan, and it's debuted here. You can't buy it anyplace else. Tor gave us some copies a week in advance. And I've got a big epic fantasy trilogy, so they're huge books, like half the length of yours. But they're Spine of the Dragon is the first one of those, and it's a fantasy trilogy that the third book comes out in January, and I'm kind of poured heart and soul into that. And it's done, and it's very satisfying, but also disappointing to be finished with the trilogy.
I know exactly how that feels. Kevin J. Anderson, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. We'll do that.
Bump.
Fist bump.
You take care. Give my best to Rebecca, all right?
All right, thanks.